The cold CEO Millionaire staged a fake engagement, but the poor girl revealed the stolen board votes. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to the main character. Alexander Reed had built his reputation on control, precision, and silence. At 39, he was the youngest CEO to ever lead Reed Global, a Fortune 500 powerhouse headquartered in Manhattan, with glass walls that reflected the city like a mirror of power. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't smile for cameras. He didn't believe in luck, and he certainly didn't believe in love. On the morning the board threatened to remove him, Alexander stood alone in his corner office, looking down from 40 floors above the street, watching yellow cabs crawl like clockwork toys. The numbers were clear. 2 votes had shifted overnight. 2 trusted board members had flipped without warning. Someone had stolen control from under him, quietly, surgically, the way corporate knives always cut. His assistant announced the meeting in a measured tone, but Alexander already knew what he needed. Not a speech, not an apology. Leverage. That was when Emily Carter entered his office, clutching a thin folder with both hands, her coat still damp from the early spring rain. She was there to deliver research summaries, nothing more, a temporary contract worker earning barely enough to cover rent in Queens. She didn't belong in this room of steel and silence, and Alexander noticed that immediately. He also noticed how she stood straight anyway, eyes clear, waiting to be dismissed. He studied her for half a second longer than necessary, then spoke with the same calm he used to approve billion-dollar mergers. I need you to pretend to be my fiancé. The words landed without emotion, like a clause in a contract. Emily thought she'd misheard. Her heartbeat spiked. She glanced at the door, then back at him. I'm sorry, what? Alexander stepped closer, stopping at a respectful distance, his voice low, controlled. A fake engagement. Public. Immediate. You'll attend. Events. Sit beside me at board functions. Smile for photos. In return, your contract becomes permanent. Your debts are cleared, and your life stabilizes. He paused, watching her process the impossible offer. This is not romance. It's strategy. The hook tightened as Emily realized this wasn't a joke. The board meeting was in 72 hours. Rumors were already leaking. Shareholders needed reassurance, and nothing reassured legacy investors like a stable image, a future, a man anchored. Alexander Reed needed a symbol, and Emily Carter, poor, invisible, underestimated, was standing in the exact wrong place at the exact right time. Outside the glass walls, the city kept moving, unaware that a single decision made in silence was about to expose a betrayal worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and that the quiet woman being asked to play a role would soon see what no one else had noticed: the missing signatures, the altered timestamps, the truth hidden between lines of corporate ink, a truth powerful enough to bring a board to its knees. Emily Carter did not answer immediately. She stood there, the thin folder pressed against her ribs like a shield, her mind racing through unpaid bills, the final notice taped to her apartment door, the voicemail from her mother's clinic reminding her that the insurance gap would not wait. She had come to Reed Global that morning worried about making rent by the end of the month, not about standing inside the gravitational pull of a man who treated human lives like chess pieces. Alexander Reed watched her with patience that felt rehearsed. He was used to people reacting with awe or outrage. Silence told him more. Emily finally spoke, her voice steady but quiet. You are asking me to lie to the public. He nodded once. I am asking you to protect the company from instability. She shook her head slightly. Those are not the same thing. Alexander did not argue. He moved back toward his desk, tapping a file with 2 fingers. You are a temporary contractor with no severance protections. Your lease expires in 6 weeks. Your student loans are in forbearance, but will resume next quarter. I do not need to threaten you, Emily. I am offering certainty. The words were not cruel, but they were surgical, and they landed exactly where he intended. Emily felt heat rise behind her eyes, not from fear, but from anger at how easily her life could be summarized on paper. If I say no, she asked, what happens? Alexander answered without hesitation. Nothing dramatic. Your contract ends on schedule. I find someone else. You continue as you were. As you were meant, struggling, invisible, one emergency away from collapse. Emily looked down at the city through the glass wall, at people rushing along the sidewalks with coffee cups and briefcases, each of them convinced they were one choice away from safety. She thought of the research she had compiled late at night, the inconsistencies she had flagged that no one above her pay grade had bothered to read. She thought of how the board members smiled politely while ignoring her presence. She had learned early that survival did not always come from being loud. Sometimes it came from staying long enough to see what others missed. How long? She asked. Would this arrangement last? Alexander's eyes narrowed just slightly. Until the vote stabilizes. Until the narrative holds. A few months, at most. He slid a single page across the desk. Not a contract, not yet, just an outline. Appearances. Events. Boundaries. No physical intimacy. No emotional expectations. It was written like a firewall. Emily read every word, committing them to memory. And if I discover something I do not like, she said carefully, something wrong inside this company? Alexander studied her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Then you keep quiet, he replied. This is not a moral exercise. It is damage control. That sentence settled into her chest heavier than the rest. Emily inhaled slowly. She knew what it meant to accept help with strings attached. She also knew what it meant to walk away empty-handed because pride refused to bend. Outside, clouds rolled in over the Hudson, dulling the light in the office. Time moved. The board meeting drew closer. Somewhere inside Reed Global, someone had already crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Emily lifted her gaze back to Alexander Reed, the cold CEO who believed control could solve everything, and made a decision that would change both of their lives. I will do it, she said, her voice calm, unreadable. But I will not be blind. Alexander extended his hand, businesslike, confident. You will not need to be, he replied. And as their hands met briefly, neither of them realized that the fake engagement meant to save a company had just placed its greatest secret directly into the hands of the one person no one had thought to watch. The paperwork arrived that same evening, delivered to a private conference room on the 32nd floor where the lights stayed on long after most of the building went dark. Emily sat alone at the long table, a leather-bound folder open in front of her, the hum of the city filtering through the glass like distant static. This was not a marriage license, not yet, but it was more than an outline. It was a framework for a lie designed to look like permanence. Alexander Reed entered without ceremony, jacket off, sleeves rolled just enough to suggest fatigue without weakness. He did not sit across from her. He sat beside her, close enough that she could smell the clean, neutral scent of his cologne, nothing personal, nothing indulgent. These are the boundaries, he said, sliding the pages toward her. Emily read carefully. No shared residence unless required by public optics. No physical contact beyond what cameras demanded. No discussion of internal board matters unless directly instructed. Confidentiality without expiration. Appearance fees deposited monthly, more money than she had ever seen attached to her name. At the bottom, a clause about termination, mutual but vague, designed to protect the company first. You have lawyers, Emily said without looking up. Why am I reading this like I am the only one who needs to understand it? Alexander folded his hands. Because you are not trained to skim past consequences. The words were not an insult. They were an assessment. Emily paused at a paragraph labeled Public Narrative Control. It outlined how their meeting would be framed, where they would be seen, which charities would be highlighted. Even their origin story had been drafted. You already decided who I am, she said quietly. To them, yes, Alexander replied. To me, you are a variable. She met his gaze then, steady. Variables change outcomes. For a moment, something unreadable passed across his face, then disappeared. He handed her a pen. Sign, and tomorrow morning the press release goes out. Emily held the pen but did not move. And the ring. Alexander opened a smaller case and set it on the table. Inside was a simple diamond, elegant, understated, chosen to suggest legacy rather than excess. Loaned, he said. Insured. Symbolic. Emily closed the case gently. Symbols matter, she replied. She signed anyway. The pen scratched softly against the paper, a sound too small for what it represented. When she finished, Alexander signed without hesitation, his name precise, practiced. He stood, then hesitated for half a second, as if remembering something important. "There is one more condition," he said. Emily looked up. "If you see something you think is wrong," he continued, "you bring it to me first." She studied him. "And if you are part of it?" Alexander did not answer immediately. The city lights reflected in his eyes, sharp points of white against dark glass. "Then you will still bring it to me," he said finally. "And we will see who is standing when the truth settles." The next morning, Emily woke to her phone vibrating nonstop. Emails, alerts, messages from numbers she did not recognize. Her name was everywhere, paired with his, framed in headlines that spoke of stability, of future, of confidence restored. By noon, she was escorted through the Reed Global lobby beside Alexander Reed himself, cameras flashing, questions shouted, his hand resting lightly at her back exactly as rehearsed. She smiled when expected, nodded when prompted, played her role with quiet precision. But as they rode the elevator up together, alone behind mirrored doors, Emily noticed something no one else had. The meeting schedule loaded on the screen listed a board session time that did not match the internal calendar she had memorized. It was off by 15 minutes. Small enough to ignore. Significant enough to hide a conversation. Emily kept her expression calm. The contract was signed. The ring was on her finger. And somewhere inside this building, the lie meant to protect power was beginning to expose the fault lines beneath it. The public announcement came that night at a black-tie charity gala held inside the marble atrium of the Metropolitan Finance Hall, a place reserved for donors whose names were etched into walls rather than printed on programs. And Emily learned quickly that wealth had its own temperature, cool, controlled, and watchful. She stood beside Alexander Reed beneath chandeliers that reflected off polished stone, her borrowed gown fitted precisely enough to make her look like she belonged, though her hands betrayed her when she clasped them together, fingers tight, knuckles pale. Cameras lined the perimeter, lenses lifting. In unison as Alexander stepped forward, his posture relaxed, his voice calm, announcing the engagement as if it were a quarterly earnings forecast. He spoke about partnership, about future, about stability, words chosen to reassure investors rather than inspire romance. And when he reached for Emily's hand, the contact was light, rehearsed, just enough to sell the image. Applause followed, polite and measured, and Emily smiled because she knew exactly when to do so, even as she felt dozens of eyes assessing her worth in seconds. She heard the whispers before she saw the faces, questions disguised as compliments, judgments hidden behind champagne flutes. Who was she? Where had she come from? How had she earned this place beside him? Alexander answered none of it, guiding her through the crowd with practiced ease, introducing her to board members whose smiles never reached their eyes. Victor Hale was among them, tall, silver-haired, his grip firm as he shook Emily's hand a beat too long, his gaze flicking to the ring as if measuring its authenticity. "Welcome to the family," he said smoothly, and something in his tone made Emily's stomach tighten. She listened more than she spoke, noting how conversations shifted when Alexander moved away, how certain names were spoken with caution, how others were avoided entirely. At one point, she excused herself to the edge of the atrium, pretending to admire a donor wall while quietly observing the flow of people, the clusters that formed and dissolved. She noticed two board members step aside with Victor Hale near a side corridor, their conversation brief but urgent, their body language closed. A moment later, Alexander received a message on his phone, his expression unchanged as he typed a response. Emily glanced at the digital display near the entrance listing upcoming private sessions and froze. The schedule posted publicly differed again from the internal version she had memorized, not just by minutes now, but by an entire session labeled as postponed when she knew it had occurred. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's air conditioning. When Alexander returned to her side, she leaned in just enough to be heard without drawing attention. "The schedule board is wrong," she said softly. He did not look at her. "It has been corrected," he replied. "By whom?" she asked. He paused, then said quietly, "This is not the place." The gala continued around them, laughter rising, glasses clinking, the illusion holding strong, but Emily could feel the shape of something shifting beneath it. Later, As they posed for photographs against a backdrop stamped with the foundation logo, a reporter asked how they had met. Alexander recited the prepared narrative flawlessly. When the microphone turned to Emily, she smiled and repeated her line. But inside she was counting details, the missing time slots, the altered listings, the way Victor Hale had avoided eye contact after that private exchange. As they left the stage together, applause fading behind them, Emily realized the engagement had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had distracted everyone except her. The ring felt heavier on her finger now, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented, a key that had just unlocked doors no one expected her to open. The days that followed moved quickly, measured in escorted entrances, private elevators, and quiet rooms where decisions were made without witnesses, and Emily found herself pulled deeper into a world that operated on implication rather than truth. Her temporary badge was replaced with permanent access, her name added to internal calendars, her presence expected rather than questioned, and yet she remained unseen in the way that mattered most. That invisibility became her advantage. Each morning she arrived early at Reed Global, earlier than Alexander, earlier than most executives, taking the same seat near the back of conference rooms where she was assumed to be decoration rather than participant. She listened as board members spoke in careful phrases, noting how certain topics were rushed through while others were lingered on just long enough to appear thorough. Financial summaries were presented with confidence, but Emily noticed the subtle pauses, the moments when eyes flicked toward Victor Hale before votes were cast. She began keeping a private ledger in her mind, matching what she heard with what she remembered from prior research, dates, numbers, signatures, the quiet discrepancies that never appeared on slides. Alexander rarely addressed her directly during meetings, but she felt his awareness like a line of tension whenever she shifted in her chair. Afterward, in hallways where voices dropped instinctively, she heard the comments meant for her to overhear, the dismissive jokes, the assumptions that she was lucky, that she had been chosen, that she would not last. One afternoon, she was invited to a small luncheon hosted by a senior board member at a private club overlooking Central Park, the kind of place where dress codes were unspoken but enforced. Emily arrived beside Alexander, her posture calm, her expression neutral, absorbing the way conversations pivoted around her without including her. She noticed how Victor Hale dominated the table, steering discussions, cutting off dissent with a smile, framing decisions as inevitabilities. When financial allocations were mentioned, Emily watched his hands, how they folded when questions arose, how he leaned back when agreement was assured. Later, as coffee was served, Emily excused herself and wandered toward the adjoining lounge, pretending to take a call while scanning a digital directory mounted near the entrance. The schedule listed committee sessions that mirrored the altered times she had seen before, the same pattern repeating, sessions moved, votes recorded out of sequence. It was not random. It was methodical. That evening, back in the car as they rode through midtown traffic, Alexander broke the silence. "You are quiet," he observed. Emily looked out the window at the passing lights. "I am paying attention," she replied. He nodded once, as if that answer satisfied him. Over the next week, Emily's routine solidified. She attended briefings, smiled at donors, accompanied Alexander to dinners where fortunes were discussed between courses. She learned who spoke freely and who measured every word. She noticed which documents were printed and which were only shared verbally. At night, alone in the apartment Reed Global had arranged for her, she replayed conversations, aligning them with public records she accessed through legitimate channels, building a mental map of influence and omission. The more she observed, the clearer the shape became. Votes had not simply shifted. They had been redirected. Proxy authorizations had been reassigned during rescheduled sessions, quorum counts adjusted just enough to pass unnoticed. Someone had understood the rules well enough to bend them without breaking them. Emily felt a mix of resolve and unease. She had agreed to play a role, not to investigate, yet the truth was pressing in from all sides. At a late evening reception, as Alexander spoke with a group of investors, Victor Hale approached Emily alone, his voice low, his smile polite. "You seem very adaptable," he said. "Not everyone adjusts so easily." Emily met his gaze, unflinching. "I listen," she replied. Victor's smile tightened briefly before. He stepped away. As the night wore on, Emily realized something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer just surviving in this world. She was understanding it. And understanding, she knew, was the first step toward changing it. The first concrete proof arrived quietly, hidden inside a routine document review that no one else bothered to attend. Emily was seated at the far end of a narrow conference room reserved for subcommittee audits, a meeting considered procedural and therefore beneath the attention of most senior members. The room smelled faintly of coffee and toner, the blinds half drawn against the afternoon sun, and as the finance officer presented projected numbers with mechanical confidence, Emily focused on the supplemental packet placed in front of her. It contained proxy authorizations, attendance confirmations, and vote certifications from the previous quarter, the same quarter that had nearly cost Alexander his position. She flipped each page slowly, comparing them to memory rather than notes, because she knew written comparisons left trails. That was when she saw it. A proxy signature assigned to a board member who, according to public records and travel disclosures, had been out of the country on the date listed. The discrepancy was small, a matter of timing rather than absence, but it was enough. Emily felt her pulse quicken as she continued, finding another authorization submitted exactly 7 minutes before a rescheduled session began, a pattern that matched the altered schedules she had noticed before. Across the table, Victor Hale spoke smoothly about compliance and oversight, his tone reassuring, his hands folded. Emily did not look up. She kept reading. When the meeting adjourned, she gathered her materials with deliberate calm and exited with the others, her mind already reconstructing the sequence. Back in the elevator, surrounded by executives scrolling through their phones, she replayed the timeline, aligning the rescheduled sessions with the proxy transfers, the moments when quorum counts shifted just enough to tip outcomes. It was not fraud in the dramatic sense. It was procedural manipulation, the kind that thrived on indifference. That evening, Emily stayed late under the pretense of organizing engagement-related correspondence, using her authorized access to cross-reference archive calendars with publicly filed disclosures. Each inconsistency reinforced the pattern. Someone had anticipated oversight and built the changes into the system itself. When Alexander returned from a dinner with investors, he found her still at her desk, the city dark beyond the windows. "You should go home," he said quietly. Emily looked up, her expression composed. "The proxy certifications from last quarter do not match travel disclosures," she replied. He paused, then closed the door behind him. "Explain," he said. She did, carefully, sticking to verifiable facts, dates, minutes, signatures, avoiding speculation. Alexander listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When she finished, he walked to the window, staring out for a long moment. "You should not be looking at this," he said finally. Emily stood. "You told me to bring concerns to you," she said evenly. He turned back to her, his jaw tight. "This kind of concern has consequences," he replied. "For you." She met his gaze. "It already does." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken calculations. Alexander exhaled slowly. "Do not pursue this further," he said. "Let me handle it." Emily nodded, but inside she felt a fracture form. Later that night, alone in the apartment, she reviewed what she could without accessing restricted systems, relying on memory, building a mental archive that could not be erased. Over the next few days, she noticed a shift. Meetings were rescheduled without explanation. Victor Hale's presence seemed to increase, his questions more pointed when Emily was in the room. One afternoon, she overheard a hushed exchange near the executive suite, Victor's voice low, urgent, another board member responding with a nervous laugh. When Victor noticed Emily nearby, the conversation stopped abruptly. "You are very observant," he said lightly. Emily smiled. "It is part of my background," she replied. He studied her for a moment, then walked away. The warning was subtle but clear. That night, as Emily lay awake listening to the distant city, she realized the truth was no longer abstract. It was closing in around her, and the engagement that had granted her access was now drawing attention she could not deflect. The stolen votes were real. The pattern was undeniable. And the question was no longer whether to act, but whether Alexander Reed would stand with the truth when it threatened the control he valued most. The tension between them surfaced fully one night after a closed-door strategy session ran longer than scheduled. the building nearly empty, as Emily followed Alexander into his office without waiting to be invited, her composure held together by focus rather than confidence. He loosened his tie and set his phone down with deliberate care, as if any sudden movement might fracture the fragile control he maintained. "You are pushing past the limits we agreed to," he said, his voice measured but strained. Emily did not sit. "I am following the pattern you told me to bring to you," she replied. "The more I look, the clearer it becomes." Alexander turned to face her, the city lights behind him casting long reflections across the glass. "You do not understand what is at stake," he said. "I understand that the votes were stolen," she answered, "and that pretending not to see it makes us complicit." He exhaled sharply, then gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit," he said. Emily hesitated, then complied. For the first time since they met, Alexander did not remain standing. He sat as well, leaning back, his expression no longer guarded by indifference, but etched with something closer to fatigue. "I built this company after my father died," he began, his tone quieter. "He trusted the board. He trusted Victor. When the market turned and he refused to cut corners, they forced him out. He never recovered. I learned early that power does not forgive hesitation." Emily listened, her posture still, her eyes attentive. "The engagement was never about you," Alexander continued. "It was about reminding them who controls the narrative. About ensuring I could not be sidelined the way he was." Emily absorbed his words, then asked the question that had been forming since the beginning. "And if the truth costs you that control?" Alexander looked away. "Then the truth becomes a liability," he said. The answer landed between them, heavy and unresolved. Emily stood slowly. "The truth is not the liability," she said. "The theft is." He looked up at her, searching her face as if seeing her fully for the first time. "You think this ends cleanly," he said. "You think exposing it restores balance. It does not." She met his gaze without flinching. "It restores choice," she replied. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic. Finally, Alexander spoke again. "If this becomes public," he said, "the board will fracture. Investors will panic. The company could lose billions in market value overnight." Emily nodded. "And if it stays hidden," she said, "you lose something else." He did not ask what. He already knew. Over the next few days, the distance between them grew subtle but unmistakable. Alexander limited her access, routed communications through intermediaries, shielded her from meetings that once included her. At events, his hand no longer rested at her back. Cameras still captured their image, but the ease had vanished, replaced by a formality sharper than before. Emily noticed the shift and adjusted accordingly, keeping her observations to herself, storing them away. One afternoon, as she prepared to leave the building, she received a message from an unfamiliar number directing her to a small cafe near the river. She did not go. That evening, Victor Hale approached Alexander during a reception, their conversation brief and tense, Victor glancing toward Emily with open calculation. Emily felt the pressure mounting, the sense that time was compressing. That night, she reviewed everything she knew, every inconsistency, every misplaced authorization, and understood that waiting would only narrow her options. The engagement had been designed to protect power, but it had also bound her fate to a man standing at a crossroads he did not want to acknowledge. As she turned off the light and lay in the quiet apartment, Emily realized that the next move would force a choice neither of them could avoid, between control and conscience, between the image they sold and the truth she carried. The shift from tension to open pressure happened faster than Emily expected, unfolding through polite emails and carefully worded invitations that carried unmistakable undertones. It began with a sudden change in her calendar, events removed without explanation, replaced by appearances that placed her alone, separated from Alexander, positioned where she could be observed. At a luncheon hosted by a regional investment group, she arrived to find Victor Hale already seated at the head of the table, his smile warm, his greeting impeccable, as if nothing stood between them. Throughout the meal, he guided the conversation with ease, speaking about stability and leadership, about how the engagement had reassured markets, how optics mattered as much as substance. When questions arose about governance, his answers were smooth, deflecting scrutiny toward future initiatives. Emily listened, noting how he framed the narrative, how he subtly positioned himself as the guardian of continuity. After dessert, as others rose from the table, Victor lingered. "You have adjusted remarkably well," he said, his tone light. "Not everyone can step into this world without missteps." Emily met his gaze. "I learn quickly," she replied. His smile thinned. "That can be dangerous," he said softly, then excused himself. The warning did not stop there. The following morning, an article appeared on a minor financial blog questioning Emily's background, her qualifications, the speed with which she had become indispensable. It was not overtly hostile, but the implication was clear. By afternoon, whispers circulated through the building, subtle but persistent, suggestions that she had overstepped, that she misunderstood her role. Alexander did not address it directly. He remained distant, focused, his communications with her reduced to logistical necessities. At a reception that evening, a board member approached Emily with a sympathetic expression. "This is a lot to take on," she said. "Perhaps you should focus on supporting Alexander and leave the governance matters to those with experience." Emily smiled politely, recognizing the rehearsed concern. As the days passed, access tightened further. Emily noticed documents she once reviewed were now restricted, meetings she attended were canceled last minute. It was a calculated squeeze, designed to isolate her without drawing attention. One afternoon, as she prepared to leave the building, a security officer stopped her politely, explaining there had been a request to review her access credentials. It was resolved quickly, but the message lingered. That night, Emily sat alone in the apartment, reviewing her mental archive, aware that memory was now her only safe repository. She considered reaching out beyond the company, then dismissed the thought. Acting prematurely would only confirm the narrative Victor was crafting. At a gala later that week, held to celebrate a new partnership, Victor approached Alexander publicly, placing a hand on his shoulder, speaking loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "We are lucky to have such unity at the top," he said, his gaze flicking briefly toward Emily. Cameras captured the moment, the image circulating within hours. The implication was clear. Unity meant alignment. Later that evening, as Emily stood near the balcony overlooking the city, Alexander joined her. For a moment, neither spoke. "This is becoming unsustainable," he said finally. Emily did not turn. "It is becoming clear," she replied. He studied her profile, the calm determination there. "Victor is pushing," he said. "He wants you to make a mistake." Emily nodded. "He wants me to disappear quietly," she said. Alexander sighed. "You should step back," he advised. "Let this pass." She turned to face him then. "And if I do?" she asked. "What happens to the truth?" He did not answer. The music swelled inside, laughter drifting out onto the balcony, the performance continuing uninterrupted. Emily realized that Victor Hale had made his move, not with force, but with narrative, painting her as the disruption, the risk. The engagement that once granted her access was now being used to undermine her credibility. As she looked out at the city lights, Emily understood that waiting any longer would allow the story to be written without her. The next step would require precision, timing, and a willingness to stand alone if necessary, because the quiet pressure she felt was not meant to scare her into retreat, but to erase her before she could speak. The fracture became unavoidable the morning Emily realized she had been formally removed from the internal distribution list for governance materials, the notification arriving without explanation, framed as a routine administrative update. She stared at the screen in the quiet apartment, the city still half asleep, and understood that Victor Hale had succeeded in narrowing her space to maneuver. When she arrived at Reed Global later that day, the atmosphere felt different, not hostile, but sealed, as if decisions were being made just beyond her reach. Alexander was already in his office when she arrived, the door closed, a rare occurrence during regular hours. Emily waited, then knocked once, firmly. He did not answer immediately, but when he did, his expression was guarded, professional. "This is not a good time," he said. Emily stepped inside anyway. "They removed my access," she said, holding up her phone. Alexander glanced at the screen, then away. "I know," he replied. The word struck her harder than she expected. "You know?" she repeated. "And you did not tell me." He moved past her toward the window. "I am containing the situation," he said. "Victor is escalating. If you remain visible, he will make you the story." Emily felt a surge of anger cut through her composure. I am already the story, she said. He is using my silence as proof that I was wrong. Alexander turned back to her. This is not about being right, he said. It is about protecting the company. The words sounded rehearsed, distant. Or protecting your position, Emily said quietly. The accusation hung in the air. Alexander's jaw tightened. You think I would sacrifice you to save myself, he said. Emily met his gaze. I think you are considering it, she replied. He looked away again. The city reflected behind him. You do not understand the pressure, he said. If this explodes publicly, the fallout will not be contained. People lose jobs. Pensions take hits. This is bigger than Victor and me. Emily stepped closer. And if the truth never comes out, she said, what does that teach them? He did not respond. The silence stretched, heavy with everything they had not said. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice lower. You need to step back, he said. For your own protection. Emily shook her head slowly. Protection from what? She asked. From the truth. His eyes flickered, just for a moment, with something like regret. From consequences, he corrected. That was when Emily understood the full extent of the rift. He was no longer weighing right and wrong. He was weighing risk. She straightened, her voice calm but resolute. If you will not act, she said, then I will. Alexander's eyes widened slightly. You do not have standing, he said. You do not have proof that can survive scrutiny. Emily held his gaze. I have patterns, she said. I have timing. I have memory. And I have a voice. He stepped toward her. If you go forward alone, he said, they will destroy your credibility. Emily nodded. They are already trying, she replied. The difference is whether I let them succeed quietly. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. I believed you when you said you wanted control so the truth would not be buried, she said. If that was never true, then this engagement really was just a transaction. Alexander did not answer. That evening, Emily packed a small bag, unsure whether she would be asked to leave the apartment by morning. Her phone buzzed with another article, this one more pointed, questioning her motives, hinting at ambition disguised as concern. She set the phone down, breathing steadily. The engagement ring felt cold against her skin. She removed it and placed it carefully on the table, not as surrender, but as clarity. Somewhere across the city, Alexander Reed stood alone in his office, staring at the same skyline, knowing he had just allowed the one person who saw the truth clearly to walk away. And, as Emily stepped into the night, the distance between them became more than emotional. It became the final obstacle standing between control and conscience. The decisive moment arrived with a board meeting scheduled under the guise of routine governance review, a session Victor Hale himself had insisted be expedited, confident that the narrative was already secured. Emily entered the building without an escort, dressed simply, carrying nothing that could be taken from her, relying instead on what could not be confiscated. The conference room filled quickly, familiar faces settling into practice seats, the hum of quiet conversation tapering off as Victor called the meeting to order with smooth authority. Alexander sat near the head of the table, his posture rigid, eyes forward, aware that something irreversible was about to unfold. When Victor opened the agenda, he moved swiftly, steering discussion toward approvals and confirmations, intent on closing before dissent could surface. Emily waited, counting beats, watching the rhythm of control. Then, when Victor announced the proxy vote ratification, she stood. The room froze. Heads turned. Victor's smile flickered, then returned, thinner than before. This session is limited to board members, he said calmly. Emily met his gaze. The ratification includes proxies assigned in rescheduled sessions, she replied evenly. And I was present for those schedules. Murmurs rippled across the table. Victor gestured dismissively. This is inappropriate, he said. Emily continued, her voice steady. On March 14th, the Finance Subcommittee session was moved forward by 15 minutes, allowing proxy authorizations to be reassigned before quorum was verified. The same pattern occurred on April 9th and May 2nd. In each case, the public calendar was altered after the fact. She did not cite documents. She cited moments. One board member was overseas during the March session, she added. Travel disclosures confirm this. A board member shifted uncomfortably. Another glanced at Victor. That is not accurate, Victor said sharply. And even if it were, it proves nothing. Emily nodded. It proves opportunity, she said. And opportunity combined with pattern proves intent. The room buzzed now, quiet but charged. Victor turned toward Alexander. "Are you allowing this?" he demanded. Alexander did not respond immediately. He looked at Emily, then at the board, the weight of his choice visible in the tension of his shoulders. Finally, he spoke. "Let her finish," he said. Emily continued. Proxy certifications were submitted minutes before rescheduled sessions began, consistently. By the same office. Quorum counts shifted by one vote in each instance. Always the same outcome. Always control. Victor rose from his seat. "This is an attack," he said. "By someone with no standing." Emily met his anger with calm. "Standing comes from truth," she replied. "And truth does not require permission." The room erupted into overlapping voices. Questions flew. Demands for verification followed. Victor attempted to regain control, but the rhythm was broken. A board member requested an independent audit. Another called for a temporary suspension of proxy authority. Alexander stood then, the room quieting instinctively. "There will be an immediate review," he said. "And until it is complete, all proxy assignments are frozen." Victor stared at him, disbelief flashing across his face. "You are making a mistake," he said. Alexander did not look away. "I am making a choice," he replied. The vote to initiate the review passed narrowly, the irony not lost on anyone present. As the meeting adjourned in disarray, Emily remained standing, her heart pounding but her posture steady. Victor gathered his things in silence, his authority diminished in a matter of minutes. As board members filed out, some avoided Emily's eyes, others nodded subtly, recognition replacing dismissal. When the room finally emptied, Alexander approached her. For a moment, neither spoke. "You knew this would cost you," he said quietly. Emily nodded. "I knew it would cost someone," she replied. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that within a glass-walled room, control had given way to conscience, and the truth that had been quietly carried was finally spoken aloud. The days following the board meeting unfolded under a new kind of silence, one that settled after upheaval rather than before it. And Emily felt it in the way conversations paused when she entered rooms, not with suspicion now, but with recalibration. The independent review moved quickly, auditors arriving with neutral expressions and thorough questions, confirming what patterns and memory had already revealed. Victor Hale was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome, his office darkened, his authority reduced to a name on an agenda rather than a presence in the room. News of the review reached the press within 48 hours, framed cautiously, but enough to signal that Reed Global was choosing transparency over denial. Market reactions were sharp but brief, a dip followed by stabilization, the storm Alexander had feared arriving and passing without the collapse he had imagined. Emily watched it all from a distance, no longer seated at the back of conference rooms, no longer escorted, but also no longer erased. Alexander called her into his office late one evening, the city glowing below, the building quieter than usual. When she entered, he was standing by the window again, but this time he turned immediately, his expression unguarded. "I owe you an apology," he said. Emily did not respond at once. She stood where she was, arms relaxed at her sides. "For doubting you," he continued, "and for believing control mattered more than truth." She studied him carefully. "You believe that because it kept you safe," she replied. He nodded. "It kept me small," he said. The admission seemed to cost him more than any market loss. He gestured toward the desk. "The board voted this afternoon," he said. "They offered me a way out, step aside quietly, preserve my reputation." Emily raised an eyebrow. "And you declined," she said. Alexander smiled faintly. "I did," he confirmed. "I told them Reed Global would not survive another truth buried to protect power." He paused, then added, "I also told them the engagement was never meant to be permanent." Emily felt a familiar tightening in her chest, tempered now by clarity rather than pain. "And what did you tell them about me?" she asked. Alexander met her gaze. "That the company owes you more than a narrative role," he said. "That you saw what we refused to see." Emily nodded slowly. "That does not undo what happened," she said. "Between us." He did not argue. "I know," he replied. The silence that followed was different from before, no longer charged with avoidance, but with possibility. Over the next week, the investigation concluded publicly, confirming procedural manipulation and recommending governance reforms. Reed Global announced new oversight measures. Investor confidence rebounded. And for the first time in months, Emily felt the weight lift from her shoulders. She received an offer from the board, a permanent position within compliance and ethics, a role that carried both authority and risk. She accepted without hesitation. The engagement quietly dissolved. The press release brief and respectful, framed as a mutual decision amid changing priorities. Emily returned the ring personally, placing it on Alexander's desk without ceremony. "This was never the point," she said. He nodded, closing the case. "No," he agreed. "It was not." Days later, as Emily prepared to leave the building after a long evening, Alexander caught up to her near the elevator. "I am not asking you to stay for me," he said. "I am asking you to stay because you belong here." Emily considered his words, then looked at him with steady resolve. "I am staying," she said. "On my terms." The elevator doors opened, reflecting them both, no longer CEO and accessory, but two people altered by a shared choice. As the doors closed, Emily realized something fundamental had changed. The truth had not only corrected a wrong, it had rewritten the balance between them, replacing leverage with respect, and setting the foundation for something that, for the first time, did not require performance. Time softened the sharp edges left behind by the crisis, not by erasing memory, but by reshaping it into something usable. Emily settled into her new role with a steady confidence, no longer a guest moving through Reed Global on borrowed permission, but a voice that carried weight because it had been earned. Her days were filled with meetings that mattered, not because of spectacle, but because of substance. Policy reviews, ethics briefings, systems redesigned so that what had happened could not happen again. She noticed how people listened differently now, how questions were asked with intent rather than dismissal. Alexander remained CEO, but the man who walked the halls was not the same one who had first asked her to pretend. He spoke less in absolutes, delegated more, invited dissent rather than managing it away. Their interactions were deliberate, careful, stripped of performance. They shared space without expectation, building something new from the absence of a contract rather than the presence of one. One evening, weeks after the investigation closed, Alexander asked Emily to join him for dinner, not as a public appearance, but quietly, without cameras or announcements. They met at a small restaurant overlooking the river, far from the places where wealth announced itself. Conversation flowed easily, grounded in reflection rather than strategy. They spoke about work, about values, about the strange clarity that comes when pretense falls away. When the bill arrived, Alexander reached for it instinctively, then paused, looking at her with a faint smile. Emily shook her head and placed her card down beside his. "Equal terms," she said. He laughed softly. Sounds still rare enough to matter. As they walked outside, the city lights reflecting on the water, Alexander stopped. He reached into his coat pocket, not with the rehearsed precision of a dealmaker, but with hesitation. "I kept this," he said, opening his hand to reveal the engagement ring. Emily looked at it, then back at him, her expression unreadable. "Not as a symbol," he continued quickly, "as a reminder of what happens when truth is delayed." He closed his hand again. "I do not want anything fake between us," he said. "Not ever again." Emily considered him in the quiet, the weight of the past months settling into perspective. "Then do not ask for promises you cannot keep," she said. Alexander nodded. "I will ask for choice," he replied. She smiled then, small but real. "That," she said, "I can give." He slipped the ring back into his pocket, not as an ending, but as a pause, an understanding that some gestures gain power by waiting. As they stood there, side by side, Emily realized how far they had come, from leverage and suspicion to respect and intention. The company was stronger now, not because it had avoided scandal, but because it had faced it. Alexander was changed, not because he had lost control, but because he had learned when to release it. And Emily, once underestimated and unseen, stood firmly in her place, not defined by an engagement or a reveal, but by the simple fact that she had chosen truth when it mattered most. The night moved on around them, unremarkable and perfect, and for the first time, neither of them needed an audience to know that something real had begun. The following spring arrived quietly, marked not by headlines but by habits that endured, meetings that ended on time, policies followed because they made sense rather than because they were enforced. Reed Global no longer felt like a fortress defending itself from scrutiny, but a structure rebuilt with intention, and Emily moved through it with a calm authority that had nothing to do with titles. She had become a constant, consulted not for appearance but for judgment, her presence a reminder of what accountability looked like when it was lived rather than announced. Alexander watched the transformation with a perspective he had never allowed himself before, measuring success not only in quarterly results but in the absence of corners cut, the willingness of his leadership team to disagree openly. Their relationship evolved with the same restraint, no grand gestures, no public declarations, only steady choices that accumulated meaning. They shared mornings reviewing agendas over coffee, evenings walking without destination, conversations that did not circle back to leverage or risk. One afternoon, as they stood together at the opening of a new community partnership Reed Global had funded, Alexander listened as Emily spoke to a small group about ethics not as compliance, but as culture. The room was modest, the applause sincere, and he realized how profoundly his definition of leadership had shifted. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Alexander asked Emily to join him on the rooftop terrace of the building, a place once reserved for strategy sessions and investor calls. There were no cameras, no staff, just the city stretching out beneath them. He stood beside her, hands relaxed, the distance between them familiar now, chosen. I spent most of my life believing control was the same as safety, he said quietly. Emily turned to him, attentive. And now, she asked. He smiled, not with confidence, but with humility. Now I know it is not, he replied. He reached into his pocket, not hurried, not rehearsed, and brought out the ring once more. This time, he did not open his hand immediately. I am not asking you to complete a narrative, he said. I am asking you to continue a life. He opened his palm, the ring catching the fading light, no longer a symbol of power, but of choice. Emily looked at it, then at him, seeing not the cold CEO she had first met, but a man who had learned to stand without armor. She took a breath, steady and sure. I will, she said. On one condition. He nodded. That we never confuse silence with peace, she continued. And that truth always comes before comfort. Alexander did not hesitate. Agreed, he said. She reached for the ring then, slipping it onto her finger with a calm that felt like arrival rather than surrender. The city lights came on around them, ordinary and extraordinary all at once. In the weeks that followed, the announcement was made quietly, without spectacle, framed not as a fairy tale, but as a partnership grounded in shared values. The response was measured, respectful, and for once accurate. Emily did not become a symbol. She remained herself. Alexander did not retreat into distance. He remained present. Together, they represented something rarer than romance built on rescue or power, a union formed after truth had already been spoken, when nothing false remained to hide behind. As they stood one evening in their shared space, looking out over the city that had tested them both, Emily realized how far she had come from the moment she had first been asked to pretend. The lie that began their story had ended in accountability. The power that once divided them had been replaced by trust. And the love that followed was not dramatic, but deliberate, chosen each day, grounded in integrity, and strong enough to stand without disguise.